The US government recently became the single largest shareholder of Intel, receiving 10% of the company's equity. This deal was very unorthodox, but is something that the current administration clearly seems eager to repeat. Just a few days ago, Trump explicitly said that he wanted to make more deals like Intel. A little earlier, Trump floated the idea of the government getting shares in TikTok in case of a sale, while he also said that the government had already received a golden share in US Steel as part of the deal to let Nippon Steel buy the firm, allowing the government to have a say in certain decisions. Unsurprisingly, loads of journalists and people in the business community are ringing the alarm bells about what they see as government interference in private businesses. And I initially expected shareholders of Intel to be particularly unhappy about the specific deal that they got because, after all, quote, the government's equity stake will be funded by the remaining $5.7 billion in grants previously awarded but not yet paid to Intel under the US CHIPS and Science Act, and $3.2 billion awarded to the company as part of the Secure Enclave program. That is money that Intel earlier claimed that they'd get for free for 0% equity based on an enforceable contract, but then they turned around and gave away 10% voluntarily and thereby diluted their own shareholders. And even worse for shareholders, the government also got to purchase its shares at a rough 20% discount versus the stock price on public markets, and Intel's board even greenlit the below-market transaction without shareholder approval. Now, normally any part of this, the dilution of 10%, the transaction below market value, etc., all of this would have normally caused Intel's share price to drop. But instead, quite the opposite happened. Intel shares actually went up after the news. Why? Well, Trump himself posted that, quote, I will help those companies that make such lucrative deals with the United States. I love seeing their stock price go up. In other words, Trump made it official government policy to boost Intel's business, and the investors are betting that he will actually follow through. So in this video, let's take a look at what this boost might actually look like. This video was sponsored by 17 Pages. At the end of every year, I like to make a set of predictions, and I don't expect all of them to turn out to be true, but this one, from 2022, turned out to be particularly prophetic. Okay, and my second prediction of the year is that Intel is going to become a sort of Boeing of the United States. Boeing, of course, is the company that makes airplanes, but on top of that, it is also a national champion of the United States that the government has decided it is so important that this company is competitive, that they're willing to do almost anything to make sure that Boeing wins and is always on top. And I think the same will happen with the whole chip industry. And Intel is the only US company that has even a chance at being, a Boeing of the chip industry for the US. So they're going to be making sure that Intel wins, whatever it takes, whether it means pumping an incredible amount of money into it, whether it means stealing trade secrets, pressuring companies like Apple and AMD and whoever to have their stuff made by Intel. It doesn't matter what it is. They're going to make it happen. And I think long-term, being on the right side of politics matters just as much as being very competitive as a business. And Intel is incredibly well set up for that. That's not bad. Mind you, I said all of this under Joe Biden's government, but almost 3 years later, that seems to have aged particularly well. Both Biden and Trump have treated chips as a national security concern where being second best is simply not an option, and both have ultimately also come to the same conclusion. Sure, America was generally winning in chip design, but it was increasingly falling behind in manufacturing. And while having foreign manufacturers like Samsung and TSMC building factories in the US was a nice first step, Intel was America's only fully domestic firm with a shot at competing at the high end. So actually, this was the firm that, just like Boeing, just couldn't be allowed to lose. And to ensure that they wouldn't lose, the administrations tried both carrots and sticks. The Biden-era government started with the carrots, showering Intel with grants and picking them to be in charge of the Secure Enclave program, which basically means Intel gets to manufacture chips for the government itself. Intel's previous CEO, Pat Gelsinger, enthusiastically agreed, and he made the largest investments in the firm's history ever, trying to catch up with the manufacturing competition from Taiwan and Korea. While Biden's subsidies did not require equity in return, they did set basically performance targets that Intel would have to hit to unlock payments. And for a while, it seemed like this was working. Intel looked like it might catch up, and the CEO claimed that any day now their foundry would start churning out world-class chips not just for itself, but also for other companies. But then, late last year, Pat Gelsinger was unceremoniously pushed out by Intel's board of directors before he could complete his vision, and he was replaced by Lip Bhutan, who claimed that Intel's big transition was just proving to be too expensive. The new CEO was saying that Intel was just spending too much money and still failing to convince firms like Nvidia and Qualcomm to switch to their factories, and so Lip Bhutan would now start cutting back on spending again, firing staff and slowing down planned projects. Essentially, he would accept that maybe Intel winning the manufacturing crown back just wasn't going to be worth the investment that they needed. And while that might or might not have been the correct choice for Intel as a private for-profit company, it certainly wasn't an option for the US government, and so Trump decided to abandon the carrots and bring out the sticks. First, he made a very clear personal threat. Quote, "The CEO of Intel is highly conflicted and must resign immediately. There is no other solution to this problem." Trump didn't specify what problem he was referring to, but we assumed that it was about finding out that Lip-Bu former company, Cadence, made a suspicious deal in China, while he himself had invested into various Chinese chip firms before he joined Intel, which might have meant he had conflicting loyalties. Now, were these deals and investments actually problematic? We don't know. Intel's board knew about and approved all of his investments when they hired him, and his specific vision for the company was the reason why they chose him. And Trump himself never mentioned these deals again after his initial threat, despite initially claiming that, and I remind you, he must resign immediately, there is no other solution to this problem. But then in less than 1 week, another solution was clearly found, because instead of resigning, Lip-Bu rushed to the White House to kiss the ring in some meetings behind closed doors, after which Intel's board voluntarily handed over 10% of the company to the US government. My conspiratorial mind tells me that perhaps Trump gave Lip-Bu an offer that he couldn't refuse, and as a result, the CEO decided to align his company with the interests of the government. Perhaps you come to a different conclusion here. Anyway, the White House of course insists that their deal is not designed to interfere with private business. They constantly remind us, for example, that, quote, "The government's investment in Intel will be passive ownership with no board representation or other governance or information rights." Trump's people have framed this deal as their government simply wanting something in return for the grant money rather than doing what Joe Biden did, who, according to them, simply handed over billions of dollars to private firms without anything in exchange. This logic is also why people like Bernie Sanders have supported this deal, and while that might partially be true, it is clearly not the whole picture. To start with, we've since learned that the agreement had an extra clause. If Intel ceases to own 51% of its foundry business, or basically sells off its manufacturing business, then the new agreement allows the government to buy more Intel equity at $20 a share, which is a big discount. This is basically a mechanism to disincentivize Intel selling off its foundry business. I don't think that's inherently something fishy, it's also essentially what Biden was trying to achieve, just using very different methods. But perhaps the most important signal that Trump definitely wants to actively interfere with Intel's business is that, he told us so. He specifically said that he wants to help the company and push up their stock price. I think that will come in the form of deals, and let's talk about what those might look like. Now remember that under Pat Gelsinger, Intel tried to win contracts from firms like Nvidia, AMD, and MediaTek in the boring, old-fashioned way. By building a competitive factory that could make better chips than their rivals. And the Biden-era governments were designed to incentivize this as well, with payouts that were linked to them hitting performance targets. Competition with a bit of state support, which is actually pretty common in the chip industry. But catching up to the likes of TSMC actually turned out to be really hard. Intel also failed to hit the milestones that they needed to unlock Biden's supposed subsidies, and the clients that they were chasing, like Nvidia and Qualcomm, didn't want to risk a very expensive switch to Intel's foundry when their position seemed pretty wobbly. In other words, Intel trying to win by, competing turned out to be pretty difficult, because as it turns out, those damn Koreans and Taiwanese are actually pretty good at what they do, and so instead, Trump got a different idea. First, as part of the equity deal, the US government actually eased Intel's CHIPS Act obligations set by the Biden-era government, and instead just gave them the money regardless of whether they hit their targets or not. Why wouldn't Trump care about performance in a firm that his government now owns? Well, likely because he knows that he can just get Intel clients almost regardless of how good their fabs actually are. He just needs to strike some deals, which is his favorite thing to do anyway. And while he hasn't said yet how he plans to do this, we've seen him apply basically the same logic to all of the problems that he faces, plus he also of course famously wrote a book about this, so we can have an educated guess. Trump's plan typically consists of 3 steps. First, gaining leverage. Second, making a deal. And third, renegotiating immediately. So let's take a look at this, starting with leverage. And Trump's favorite tool for this is an existential threat. With Intel, he achieved this by threatening the CEO personally. With Apple, he did this by threatening the firm's imports. Meanwhile, with global trade partners, he did this by announcing the Liberation Day tariffs. Trump loves intimidation as an opening move because it immediately forces the other party into a negotiation in a way that Trump feels he holds all the cards. So let's imagine what intimidation might look like for chip companies that he might want to convince to start working with Intel, and thankfully there are loads of options. A proposed tariff of up to 300% on incoming chips is probably the newest one in his toolbox. But earlier, we've seen export bans to China being used by both the Trump and the Biden-era government. Trump has said that he might limit chip exports to Europe, for example, if he doesn't like our digital laws here. And of course, we can't forget the US limitations on EUV machines and other chip equipment that they have used to block even foreign firms like TSMC or Samsung for making chips for clients that the US doesn't approve of, like Huawei. The US government has control over a massive number of technologies and companies across the whole chip creation spectrum, and so they can make an existential threat for basically any chip company except for maybe in China. And whichever threat Trump ends up using, he will follow that up with step 2, using the threat to get the firm to accept a bad deal. For Intel, the deal was the CEO keeping his job, but handing the Trump government 10% of his company. The CEO even said that I don't need the grant, but I really look forward to having the US government be my shareholder. Yeah, I bet he does. Similarly for Tim Cook, Apple got an exception to tariffs in exchange for public displays of subservience and commitments to US manufacturing, while trade partners like the EU, Canada, and so on managed to avoid an all-out trade war by accepting unfavorable trade deals. So what deals could Trump convince the chip firms to accept? Well, he's already said that the firms could be exempted from his proposed 300-ish% tariff if they came to some agreement with him, for example. And while we haven't seen the details about this yet, it's hard to see how a chip firm switching to Intel's factories wouldn't be the most surefire way for them to avoid tariffs, given that doing so would literally make Trump's government money. I totally expect various chip CEOs to show up in the White House and make this proposal any day now. So that would be step 2, right? Some firms would feel sufficiently threatened that they'd actually move some of their manufacturing over to Intel, and they'd say, okay, well, maybe this wasn't their favorite thing to do ever, but they've at least averted some bigger crisis, right? But no, because Trump never likes to give up his original source of leverage, which means it's time for step 3, renegotiating immediately. With Intel, for example, Lip Bhutan was never actually cleared of his Chinese allegations. Trump just stopped talking about them, but whenever he wants a better deal, he can just bring those out again. Similarly, while the European Union, for example, thought that they could at least buy some peace by signing their trade deals, Trump needed no more than a few weeks to threaten them with new tariffs again, unless they also agreed to further demands around digital services. Meanwhile, Tim Cook has already gone through 2 rounds of appeasements, making bigger and bigger concessions with each one, but surely a third one is just around the corner as well. People think that by having a contract or a signed agreement, they'll have secured some stability, but that's just not how Trump works. As long as he has the power, he can just keep squeezing and renegotiating. So what could that look like for Intel and the chip firms? Well, we don't know, but here's my prediction. Why not tell foreign chip designers like Taiwanese giant MediaTek that they have to fully move their production over to Intel or get destroyed by a combination of sanctions and tariffs? Or better yet, why not eventually force foreign manufacturers like Taiwan's TSMC and South Korea's Samsung hand over their know-how to Intel to help them catch up? If they don't, they could get banned from taking contracts from US chip designers like Nvidia, or also be banned from using US tech and chip manufacturing, which would essentially mean bankruptcy. Now, many people would complain, of course, but Trump has already claimed multiple times that Taiwan stole America's chip industry, for example, and he could just claim that America simply needs its national champion, Intel, to be given back its stolen business for national security purposes, for example. It sounds crazy, but it's no crazier than claiming that he needs all of Greenland for the same reason. Or better yet, he could declare, for example, that this technology transfer would be the price that he demands Taiwan and Korea pay him for the US Army protecting them from China. Why not? Now, I'm obviously speculating here, and I don't know if Trump will go quite this far, but I'm trying to make an extreme example to illustrate the direction that we're going towards. And I do think I'm directionally correct. Well, the only explanation that I can find for investors rallying after Trump's takeover of Intel is also that other people are betting on something like this happening as well. And while I have presented my take, I also realize that other people who are smart and thoughtful have come to very different conclusions about this same deal. Ben Thompson from Stratechery, for example, called the Intel deal the least bad option and made a strong case for why it might just make sense. Meanwhile, the Washington Post wrote a great piece about how, quote, the government's Intel take is antithetical to American greatness, explaining why they think this deal is a bad idea. I've linked to both of those in the description, and I recommend reading those as well so you can make up your own mind about what you expect to happen. And if this idea of a really complex topic being explored from multiple completely different perspectives and then you being left to make up your own mind about it is something that you think you would enjoy, then I think you would really love 17 pages. 17 Pages is a fantastic full-length documentary movie about the case of massive fraud in science. Or was it actually fraud? You get shown all the evidence from the interviews with the people who claim to have documented the fraud, to documents from the Secret Service, the actual scientific papers, and of course, in the end, you get to decide where you land. I went through such a roller coaster of being convinced of one side and then the other, and then at the end, the twist completely blew my mind. This documentary was made by Bobby Broccoli, who's easily one of my favorite creators on the whole internet, and it's exclusive to Nebula for two very good reasons. First, the twist in the story actually required Nebula to build a completely unique streaming feature for it to work. I can't tell you what it is without spoiling things, but it's awesome and it literally couldn't have been made without control over the platform. But then second, Nebula is also how creators like Bobby, but then also many others, can get funding for much bigger and much more ambitious projects like these. I myself have done a dozen bonus videos for Nebula and also a full Nebula original series called Technorama, and there's tons of other great stuff on there too. When you get Nebula, your subscription directly goes towards helping us make better content and towards making the platform itself better. There are no ads, no shady tracking, just a simple good deal. Better yet, with my link go.nebula.tv/TechAltar, which is also linked in the description, you can also get a big discount, which brings the price of Nebula down to just $36 a year, instead of the usual $60 that you'd get when signing up using a generic link. That is just $3 a month and a pretty big discount, so be sure to use my link go.nebula.tv/TechAltar or scan the QR code on screen to sign up, and if you absolutely hate ongoing subscriptions, there's even a lifetime option using that link. And once you have a subscription, you can even share that with a friend using our guest passes feature, so you can actually share your favorite shows with your friends. Nice! So check out the links below and I'll see you over there.